Good evening. Thank you for coming and welcome to tonight's debate on faith and education. I'm Daniel Weiss, a lecturer in the Faculty of Divinity, and I'm a co-organizer of this event along with Arif Ahmed, a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Philosophy here. And let me just begin with a few words of thanks. First, thanks to Philip Pothen and to the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council for helping to sponsor this debate alongside other AHRC 10th anniversary debates taking place across other UK higher education institutions. Thanks also to Rosalind Gregory and the Research Strategy Office for helping us put together the proposal for this event. And thanks to Daniel Wunderlich for putting together the very nice series of posters outside that you can see when you leave of AHRC-funded PhD projects currently going on in the University of Cambridge. And to St. John's College for hosting us in this excellent event space. And most importantly, to Malavika Anderson and all the work she's put in, along with the rest of the Festival of Ideas team, helping to coordinate the various aspects of this event behind the scenes. And so just a couple words about the theme. The series of AHRC anniversary debates are centered around the theme of the way we live now. And as such, we've organized this event in order to have a chance to air different considered views on the way in which faith and religion currently intersect with education in the UK, as well as whether change in this regard ought to occur. We'll be looking at the significance of the study of religion and of different religious traditions in state school curricula, as well as the idea of faith schools, namely schools that are formally linked to specific religious traditions. And so we can ask questions about, is there a need for students in schools today to learn about the traditions, beliefs, and practices of different religious traditions in connection with a number of potential goals, for understanding how various human communities have thought about questions of ethics, God, society, politics, as well as for students to gain better understanding of their neighbors and fellow UK citizens, as well as for a more grounded understanding of members of religious traditions in an international context. Or is it the case that learning about different religious traditions is something that should take place outside of a school curriculum context? Likewise, we could ask, are faith schools, by allowing different religions to incorporate aspects of their tradition into the broader general curriculum for their specific school, is this something undesirable for the common good? Or conversely, would the elimination of faith schools be harmful to the common good? And specifically, we've drawn upon a panel of distinguished thinkers and writers, public figures, in order in the context to reflect on the importance of humanities research in the study of religion and the phenomenon of lived religion through various different disciplines, the discipline of philosophy, of theology, of history, as well as literary studies, social studies, etc., in order to ask broader questions about these themes of religious particularity in a diverse society. Is religion something outmoded or bound up with cultural flourishing? And then how do these questions tie into the crucial and concrete debate over what contemporary education in this country should address or contain? And just as a note, the AHRC specially commissioned a poll through YouGov that asked over 2,000 people about these topics, which the results showed a diverse range of views currently held by respondents across the UK. And the chair of the debate, who I'll introduce in a second, will be remarking on some of these poll results, and he will also be introducing our four distinguished panelists. So let me introduce that chair. It's Mr. Jamie Britton, who is the director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media for Demos. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Jamie Britton. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you all very much for coming. I've actually replaced someone, Catherine Nye, BBC journalist who was supposed to be chairing, had to rush off at the last moment for some reporting work, and so you have me instead. But I'm extremely pleased and honoured to be your chair for this evening. So thank you all. Thanks to the panel, who I'll introduce momentarily, and of course thanks to all the organisers that have helped to put this on. You're probably wondering why somebody who works on social media is chairing this at all. Actually, it's one of a number of things that I do at the think tank Demos, which covers a rather large number of different social and public policy issues. I also specialize there in extreme radical political and social movements. Indeed, I'm just halfway through my second book called Radicals, about radical political, social, religious movements. So I approach this subject from, I suppose, the extreme fringes, but it's certainly a subject that I've been following very closely over the years. And the question of faith and education, of course, is an extraordinarily topical one for all of us. You heard already the poll that was commissioned for this series of debates. And just one finding, really the finding that surprised me the most. This was a very, very robust poll. 3,000 adults, I think it was, commissioned by YouGov, and it found that 77% of adults in the UK believe that religious education should be part of the national curriculum, whether obligatory or not obligatory, but 77%. That number, however, varied significantly according to which religion you asked about. And it's no surprise, given the sorts of media stories that we've been hearing lately in relation to things like the so-called Trojan horse affair. And so whether it is about established religions, quote-unquote, role in education, or newer religions' role in education, particularly with the recent publication of the government's anti-extremism bill, proposed bill, which places a statutory obligation on schools to monitor signs of extremism, this is a debate that is not going to go away. Incidentally, just so you know, I went to a religious school, age 4 to 18, a Catholic school. I enjoyed it very much. I was even an altar boy in the local church. But I'd probably consider myself to be something of a secularist now. And I think, like many people, on this discussion, I take something of a pragmatic view. But I'm always torn between a belief in parental choice and a belief in the fact everyone should have really the same education. And those two tensions, for me, I can't always resolve easily. But I do think that the debate on this subject would certainly be much improved if it weren't always associated with terrorism and extremism and so on. But the world is as we find it, as indeed it was in 1944 when we established the tripartite education system. Now, some quick ground rules for you all so you know how this is going to go. Each speaker has 10 minutes. I think they're going to remain at the table, but maybe someone's going to get up onto the podium. 10 minutes, so a relatively brief introductory set of remarks. We will then have a moderated discussion between us for 20, 25 minutes or so, at which point we open it out to the floor for your questions and comments. And in fact, we open it out to a much wider audience because this is being live streamed. These days, if something isn't being live streamed and tweeted, it's not really happening, is it? So it needs to be being live streamed. And I will be trying to take a couple of questions from the people who are watching online. So hello, wherever you are. I don't even know where I'm looking because I can't see a camera. Is it these guys over there? Welcome to the discussion. I will be taking a couple of questions from you as well. Daniel, you mentioned that we had to turn our phones off, but we have a hashtag up here. So do we need to turn them off entirely, or can we just turn them on to silent? Just to silent, good. So you do use the hashtag if you have any comments and remarks that maybe you don't want to share publicly. Well, I say that, but you share them online and then everyone in the world can see them. But that you don't want to share in this room. And then maybe we'll be able to take some of those as well. At 7:50, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to make some final summary remarks and then hand over to Arif, who will explain what happens then. So, without further ado, I'll introduce each speaker as they go. First up is Andrew Copson. He is the Chief Executive of the British Humanist Association. And Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to start with thinking a little bit about the title of the session today, which includes the words, the challenge of change. And I think that although the poll that you've all read about included one question about what religious affiliation people in Britain are today and provided a snapshot of that, I think it's worth us thinking at the very beginning of what the more general trends to do with religion and belief in Britain are today, because of course change is real, it is happening, probably at a more accelerated pace now in terms of religious belief in the UK than any other time in our history. And I think we need to think about that and take that seriously when we then try and think about the education system and how that should treat questions of religion or belief in the context of those social trends and changes. Well, there are three main trends that are transforming the religion and belief landscape of Britain today. I'll talk about the rest of the world in a moment, but of Britain today. And these trends certainly have held true over the last few decades. They seem to be quite robust. There's no reason to believe at the moment that they're going to in any way be reversed. The first is the rapid and massive increase in the number of people who are not religious. Pretty obvious. Part of our lived experience every day, I'm sure. The second is the reducing size but also the increasing diversity of Christianity in the UK. And the third is the introduction into the UK, mainly through immigration, of a significant but still quite small percentage of people who follow religions other than Christianity. So let's think for a moment about the increase in the non-religious. Anything between 30 and 51% of people in the UK today, if you ask them if they identify with any particular religion or denomination, will say no. It depends on precisely on what question you ask, because we're the victims of survey questions, and we're much more predictable and malleable than we think we are when faced with a pollster and an instrument of that sort. So between 30 and 51% is what we can certainly say. That has changed from about 30. The 51% has gone up from about 30% in 1983, and it's changing very rapidly, and it's generational rather than age-related. So the people who said they know religion 20 years ago when they were younger still say that now, and young people really almost overwhelmingly are not religious. But it's not just in terms of identity, it's also in terms of beliefs. Most people don't have recognisably orthodox religious beliefs in the UK anymore, and also, of course, most people don't engage in any sort of religious practice. Not only in terms of a weekly or a monthly basis, but even our rites of passage have been completely transformed away from religious forms and norms in the last few decades. Most marriages now are non-religious. In Scotland, humanist marriages, where they're legal, have even overtaken Church of Scotland marriages. Most funerals take place outside of a religious context. And all those trends are set still to increase. So that's the first trend, the massive increase in the number of people who have non-religious approaches to life, non-religious worldviews. The second trend, this reduction but also diversification of Christianity is also extremely important. When our current religious and schools settlement was instituted in 1944, most people would have said that they were Church of England. Today, not even most Christians would say that they were Church of England. Under 16% of people in the UK say that they're members of the Church of England. That's a minority of people who say they're Christians. And of course, the fastest growing Christian denominations are various evangelical Protestant denominations. It won't be long, probably 5 or 6 years, until there are more Roman Catholics than Anglicans in the UK. So the diversification of Christianity, really becoming very, very diverse as a group, is also extremely interesting and has salience for how we think about the education system. The third trend is the one about which there is the most noise, for all sorts of other reasons that were hinted at the beginning, but which in fact is accounted for by just well under 10% of the entire UK population, which is the very recent arrival on the religion and belief scene in significant numbers in the UK of people who identify with or believe in or practice a religion other than Christianity. And of course, we know that the largest such group is Muslims of various sorts, coming in at somewhere around 4 to 5%, and other religions at much smaller percentages, to the extent that on many surveys, unlike on the national census, on many surveys they don't even register, but nonetheless they are have a real presence in many towns and other communities in the UK today. So those three trends, I think, are the ones that we need to bear in mind when we think about our education system. And I think that's important because when you look at our education system in relation to religion, it truly does bear all the hallmarks of still being stuck in 1944, not even really in 1988, which is the last time it was substantially updated. Religious education syllabuses, which are the main place where young people are meant to think about and learn about beliefs and values, develop their own worldviews, but also be equipped with the skills to encounter and understand children and later on fellow citizens with different worldviews. Those lessons still overwhelmingly focus on Christianity. They pay almost no attention at all to the sort of non-religious beliefs and values that the majority of those young people will carry out into the world, and through which the filter of which they will see their lives and their experiences. I think that needs to change. There is still compulsory daily Christian worship in schools in England and Wales and in Northern Ireland, and although in many secondary schools that does not actually happen on a daily basis, in primary schools it still does. And of course there are faith schools which continue to divide children by religion or belief at a time when, especially because of the growing diversity in terms of the third trend that I talked about of society, we really need schools that are common. So that would be my opening pitch. I think that if we do engage seriously in light of the three trends that I've mapped out with each area of our education system, we will need to see it not just reformed but completely transformed, entirely really revolutionised, and I hope that one day we'll have a government that will come to grips with that.
Thank you very much indeed. You do realise you've still got 2 minutes.
Well, in that case, let me say something.
Could you? I wonder if you might just say in 2 minutes
something more about the world.
Something more about what it might look like, what this revolutionised.
Yes, I'd love to. I mean,
like.
I clearly mistimed myself. I felt I was, if anything, over time, but obviously I'm under time. Well, I think very clearly it is a mistake to pursue the policy in relation to faith schools that's currently being pursued in England of increasing their number and their diversity. England alone of all the parts of the United Kingdom is an area where religious schools, which were decreasing in number and proportion until 2002, has been increasing. And I think that's almost certainly a mistake. In Scotland, we have state-funded Catholic schools. In Northern Ireland, we have state-funded Catholic and Protestant schools. In Wales, we have state-funded Catholic and Church in Wales schools. And in England, we have Catholic, Anglican, Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish schools. I think that the increasing tendency to separate children by religious identity, or really, even worse, your parents' religious identity or religious practice, is extremely damaging to social cohesion. If you think about a well-integrated minority like British Jews, for example, the percentage of children of British Jews educated in Jewish schools is higher now than it's ever been since the introduction of universal state education. It's getting higher all the time. And I think that that's a very damaging trend. So I think that in the context not only of continuing secularization of the population in general, which means that very soon there won't be enough people to stock up the Christian schools unless they continue to lie and pretend they're Christians every Sunday in order to get their children into the school, together with the need for social cohesion in the light of an increasing diversity of children from different backgrounds, means that certainly we need to educate our children together, learning with and from each other in shared contexts, and not in separate religious schools, especially in the state system. And I think it's I think that was well reflected in the poll data. Most people actually do think that it would be better for that to be the case. In terms of, have I run out of time yet?
30 seconds.
Pause for thought. In terms of religious education, I think that's a more interesting question. There is very divergent practice actually across the different nations and the different jurisdictions of the UK. I think that we would be better moving towards a model such as that currently operates in Scotland, where there's a subject called religious and moral education, still not a perfect name, but the subject content is quite good, which would encourage children to learn about a sort of a wider range of beliefs and values with very explicit aims, both firstly of formulating their own worldview and approach to life, understanding their fellow citizens' worldview and approach to life, and I think that would help to counter the trend which too often is dominant in religious education in England and Wales, which is to sort of make a fetish of content and to teach a lot of stuff about Christianity which no one is really very interested in, and which is almost useless in terms of understanding other people or developing your own personal beliefs. Now, I was a classicist when I was at university, and these were the subjects I also enjoyed best at school, so I'm by no means an enemy of information that it can be practically useless. It can be extremely enjoyable and fulfilling, but whether it should occupy a privileged and compulsory part of the school curriculum, I'm not quite sure. I think to the extent that we can justify a lot of curriculum room for a subject that engages with religious and non-religious beliefs and values, it is the extent to which it should enable young people to develop their own views, explore their own beliefs and values on important questions, and also contribute in their development as good fellow citizens and understanding fellow human beings of people with different beliefs.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much indeed. If you didn't notice, Rowan Williams's eyebrows raised in a couple of those remarks. I could see it from here. I wasn't sure if you could see it at the back, but I thought I'd let you know. That was good, and 10 minutes. I hope the other panellists will take note. And I will now hand over to Adam Dinham, who is a Professor of Faith and Public Policy at Goldsmiths University of London and a Professor of Religious Literacy at the University of Oslo. The floor is yours.
I'm going to start by saying I think faith schools are a symptom, not a cause. And though I agree with a lot of the basic premises of what Andrew says, I'm going to start in a different place. But by saying that I think education about religion and belief is in a total muddle from top to down, and I think it's really urgent that we do something about it because it contributes to a lack of what I've been calling religious literacy, by which I mean that there's a lamentable quality of conversation about religion and belief across British society, probably Western society more generally, just at a point when we need it most. And what that gives rise to is knee-jerk reactions and ill-informed and often ill-tempered public debate, as any readers of the recent Daily Mail reports of my supposed desire to ban sausage rolls in workplaces will have noted. So I think the process of sorting out how we teach and learn about religion and belief could in itself drive a great deal of reclaiming that religious literacy. And as I say, I think this is a really urgent task. So what's the problem? Well, Andrew's started to outline some of that. We've got a 1944 Education Act, which makes it mandatory for fully funded state schools to have what are called agreed syllabuses for religious instruction, developed within local educational authorities which no longer have any real traction, by a syllabus conference consisting of representatives of the Church of England and other Christian denominations. So it's essentially Christian. The 1988 Education Reform Act introduces a national curriculum but without RE in it, and also introduced multi-faith SACREs, the Standing Advisory Councils for Religious Education, which replaced the old Christian syllabus conferences. And the agreed syllabuses are now required, and this is a quote, to reflect the fact that religious traditions in Great Britain are in the main Christian, whilst taking account of the teaching and practices of the other principal religions represented in Great Britain. And I'll come to that question of Britain as Christian in a minute. We know that in 1994, the School Curriculum and Assessment Authority published a new model syllabus to move to including 6 main religions. And then in 2004, the QCA introduced another national framework in which the range of religions to be studied was further widened. And it was recommended this time that students also have the opportunity to study what it called secular philosophies, such as humanism. So the point of all that is there's been a whole range of these and other statutory and non-statutory tinkerings since 1944, and these have all usually been in the direction of trying to keep up with a changing religion and belief landscape in the real world. So big moments in that have included the shift from learning from religion to learning about religion, the broadening out from religious instruction to religious education. But the trouble with that is that changes in the real religious landscape have far outpaced changes in the education about it. And I come back to the 1988 Act's representation of, remember the quote, religious traditions in Great Britain being in the main Christian. I think that's at least a debatable point. And in the light of Andrew's comments about the growth in non-religion, it's probably considerably more than debatable. So we know that the religion and belief landscape has changed since the 1944 settlement. Research now suggests that religion and belief has become much stretchier. It's much more fluid, apparently. There's a rise in the spiritual and informal and non-traditional forms, alongside a decline in the traditional forms like Anglican Christianity, and a realignment to a growth in other forms of Christianity like Pentecostalism, as well as more other religions, and as Andrew said, especially Islam, and an increase of those reporting no religion. The numbers I would cite are lower than Andrew's, up from 15% in the 2001 census to 25% in the 2011 census, but nevertheless, very substantial numbers. And we've got another pressing reason why we need to deal with this urgently, because at the same time, the Equality Act in 2010 gives us another reason to update our educational practices, introducing, as it does, protection against discrimination in the provision of services and in employment on the grounds of what it calls religion or belief. So we've got another stretching of the spectrum, not just religion, but religion or belief. But that in itself is a further example of the religious literacy problem that I've been talking about, because the definition of religion or belief in the Act is given as this: any religion, religious or philosophical belief, not taking us forward particularly far. And a philosophical belief is deemed to be one if it meets the following criteria: that it's genuinely held, it's a belief, not an opinion, it's weighty and substantial, it has a certain level of cogency and seriousness, and it should be worthy of respect in a democratic society. So these are very difficult tests to establish. So the point of all that is to say that we have what amounts to a mid-20th century settlement for an early 21st century reality. That settlement is largely Christian, whereas the reality now seems to be much more one of believing without belonging, and a country which is Christian, yes, but also plural and secular, all at the same time. And it's in the vacuum that the education model that I started with drifts on. So now I come to the second part of what I want to say, which is what should we do? Where should religion and belief learning go next, and where should it begin and end? And I'm going to pose some questions rather than answers. Starting with, should it happen in RE at all? Or could it take place in something more distributed around other subjects and learning, like the Reformation in history, or the Bible in English literature, and so on? Or do we need a combination of both? I think we probably do. What should be its relationship to the act of worship, which is still required by the 1944 Act, but is extremely patchily delivered? What should be in the learning? What should the content be? And I'm afraid that this whole lack of clarity about learning about religion and belief means that the space of RE is largely colonised by proxy issues like citizenship and cohesion, rather than religion and belief themselves. And that's compounded by a squeeze on time. Did you know that there's about 45 minutes a week standard teaching of religion and belief in schools. So we've got a colonisation, but also a marginalisation of the RE space. And many schools have taken to coping with this by putting on special RE days, for example, instead of a timetabled subject. And others have rebranded it as things like philosophy and ethics or PSHE. So that's within schools, but then the structural landscape of education hasn't helped either. So about a third of all schools in the country are Christian, mostly Church of England, but also Catholic, technically described as schools with a religious character, not faith schools, distinct from faith schools. We know that since 2000, the Academies programme has sprung up. More and more schools are now academies, and they're outside of structural control anyway. They're not subject to the national curriculum and so on. And that goes for free schools too, which are also growing, and of course have drawn lots of concern and attention, usually in relation to unhelpful episodes like Trojan Horse in Birmingham, as Jamie mentioned in his comments. The role of the sacres is also hugely contested and variable, I should say as well. Why should learning about religions be so largely determined by what could be regarded as vested interests? Would we like economics to be organised by directors of city banks and so on? And then the 2010 review, most recently, of the national curriculum left RE out once again, and it's not in the new EBAC either. So we've got these basic questions to ask, and I've nearly finished, but I wouldn't stop there in schools. I want to take this more broadly. We need to know, I think, what we're intending to do with religion and belief learning all the way up and down the educational ladder. So in nursery, primary, secondary, FE, HE, professional training, doctors, medics, and so on, and in CPD, continuing professional training once people are on the job. And that's a huge challenge, of course. And just to take one example in my own corner in higher education, we have, I think it's only 16 now, theology and religious studies departments in the country, though there are more courses than that sitting outside departments. We have a split between sociology and the sociology of religion, although it's beginning to mend a bit. And my own research with vice-chancellors shows that universities tend often to think of themselves as secular, by which they usually mean neutral. And the professions, especially in health and social care, appear perfectly comfortable to talk about things like well-being and spirituality, but get really chary when talking about religion. So the question is, how well are they dealing with the plurality of religion and belief in their service users when they encounter that in everyday life? So interesting times, I think. The challenges are to get religion and belief learning right across the educational spectrum, fit for 21st century purpose. And that's going to take a lot of political will, goodwill in the conversation, and a huge amount of work.
And thank you very much. Everyone just save your thunderous applause to the end. I'm going to round it all up in one go. Just tell me the sausage roll thing. What you called for the banning of...
I should never have said it. I was reported as having called for the banning of sausage rolls in workplaces, which I certainly have not done. In fact, I've never mentioned a sausage roll before the Daily Mail's report in relation to religious literacy or many other things for that matter. Okay. Maybe at Christmas.
I couldn't let that one go without at least one mark. Okay, good. We're running to time. Next we have Farid Panjwani. I believe you had some trouble getting here on the Dartford Tunnel, but I'm glad you made it on time, who's the Director of the Centre for Research and Evaluation in Muslim Education at the Institute of Education in London. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to share some thoughts with this august gathering. It is a very esteemed institution. I have very fond memories of classes I took here many years ago. And also apology for the delay. I got stuck in the famous traffic on the motorway, but I'm glad that I managed. I would also like to start with some remarks on the title of the debate, which I found very interesting. Its simplicity is deceptive as it hides the complex layers of history of ideas underneath. For example, it uses the word faith and not religion. The two terms have very different genealogies and different implications when juxtaposed with education. The title also notes an uneasy relationship between faith and education, but of course, education itself has become an issue of concern, and as we find it increasingly under the shadow of economics. Perhaps it will be useful to have another debate as well under the title Education and Economics, the Uneasy Partnership. But given this complex ideas which underpin the title itself and given the limitation of time, I would like to start by making a couple of assumptions. One, that I will take the word faith to actually be a synonym for religion in this context, today's event. I would also assume that by education we mean a liberal education with the aim of helping students lead a flourishing life, a central component of which is the development and judicious use of autonomy. And I think I would also go with the assumption that a vast number of people are in favor of having some kind of education about religion in the school, as was shown in the survey that was referred to earlier as well. So it seems to me that the option that we can simply break this relationship between education and religion, uneasy though it may be, is unfeasible, and perhaps most people would also find it to be undesirable, given that we would like people to know about the diversity of beliefs and diversity of people with whom we live, the development of critical religious literacy, and also simply the ideal of an educated person in today's world perhaps ought to include knowledge about the human experience of religion. So it seems to me that the real challenge we face is how do we make this partnership between faith and education work? And I have much sympathy with the view that education should help nurture autonomy in children, and particularly as they move into secondary education. And a lot of things that I will say pertain more to secondary schools. I believe introducing children to religio-cultural traditions is not antithetical to developing their capacity for autonomous thinking, provided it is done with an appropriate pedagogy. The social nature of human self does not preclude autonomy. In fact, it is a prerequisite for it. And the difference between an autonomous and non-autonomous person is not whether they are socialized or not, but the manner in which the socialization has taken place. So my starting point is that the religious education ought to contribute to the nurturing of autonomy and promote the liberal aims of education. And where it doesn't, then it should raise some concerns. But the question is it possible to nurture students' autonomy through religious education? I believe it is. However, this will require some serious rethinking, not only about how religion is taught, but what do we mean by religion? How do we even conceive this idea of religion? And I would like to propose that the very understanding of religion with which we work in religious education, both in faith schools as well as in community schools, and which often is assumed in the papers that the government publishes, is part of the problem that we are facing and we need to rethink. And I want to make some comments about it. I believe often we understand religion and teach religion as a finished product, something to be passed on, transmitted in a manner that is not conducive to nurturing autonomy. Let me be more specific, and I will use Islam as an example, not because there is anything particular about it, but only because this is the tradition I'm most familiar with. Let's start with some of the questions that you must have heard and are very common. The questions like, is Islam compatible with human rights? Is Islam compatible with democracy? What does Islam say about science? What is Islam's position on women? These are very common questions that you can find everywhere. And many textbooks also approach Islam in this manner, seeking to give students some answer about what Islam says about these things. Now, I would like to suggest that these questions actually betray a deep misunderstanding about religions, and in this case, Islam. And that is because they encourage what one would call a reification of Islam. And reification means you take an idea and then take it as if it's a real thing that you can touch and you can feel. And this is what these questions do. They make Islam as if it's a thing that can have a very monolithic answer to these questions, what it says about democracy, about human rights, and other things. I'll give you a very specific example. Let's say if we ask the question, what does Islam say about other religions, about Christianity, Judaism, and others? I think the way the question is framed itself, we cannot answer that question. Now, one might say we can, we'll just have to look at the Quran, and the answer would be found there. But I'm afraid that will not be the case, because when you look at the Quran, you will find that there are verses in the Quran which are very warm and hospitable towards other religions of the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And there are verses which are not very hospitable, which actually are quite hostile in some ways towards the religions that are there. And that is because over the 23 years that the revelation took place in Muslim belief, the social context changed, the historical context changed, and the revelation was in part responding to it, and therefore you find different point of view. And it is therefore not a surprise that over the history of 1400 years, you have a variety of responses to this question as what is Islam's response. You have responses which are extremely brutal and torturous, to responses which are extremely warm, unifying, and universal in spirit. And that is not a surprise given that the Quran itself is very polyphorous in this regard. And I think this then raises the question, which of these is really Islamic? Which one is really the answer to the question that what does Islam say? And of course, this different possible readings is not just an issue with the Quran, but it's part of any scripture, and in fact, any great literature lends itself to these multiple readings. And it is true not only for how does Islam looks at other religion, but also if you ask the question about free will and predestination, you ask the question about women, you ask the question about the end of the life, any question you ask, you are not likely to get a single answer, but you are likely to get many Muslim responses. And therefore, I would like to propose that on these and other matters, there is no one Islamic position. What we have are different Muslim understandings on how and what Islam says about these things. And if this is correct, then what we are seeking and what we are suggesting is a pedagogical shift in how Islam, and for that matter, any religion is taught. We need to ask new questions, not what does Islam say about religions, but how have Muslims understood Islam's relationship with other religion? Not is Islam compatible with democracy, but how have Muslims understood democracy and its relationship with Islam? These questions, focused as they are on social actors, lead to simultaneous investigation of religious thought, ideas, and social and historical context. And they require the tools of the humanities and social sciences alongside theology. So to conclude, my thesis is that it is not Islam, or for that matter, any religion, that really has position on anything, but it is Muslims who believe what Islam says about different things. And in saying what they say, they draw upon the scripture, upon the life of the authority figures that they take as sacred, and the history to come up with their responses. And it is this interpretive activity that should be the focus of teaching of RE. It will help students understand how, even for those who believe in divine revelation, the necessity of human agency in interpreting the text is inescapable. This exposure to the diversity is not only in line with the history of Muslims, and again Islam is only an example here, but can also help promote autonomy in the sphere of religion. When students learn and are introduced to this variety of historically situated responses and resulting diversity, they are likely to observe that there is no ready-made answers to the questions. They may observe that it has been appropriate for Muslims in the past to give different responses and understand the sacred text in different ways, and this may then give them this empowerment that they too can form their own opinions and answers to the big questions about them. And I think students then will see themselves not just simply receiving a tradition, but being part of it and having empowerment to actually, if they choose so, to continue to create. So I believe that a fruitful relationship between religion and education is possible, but it is only possible if we think of religion not as a finished product, but as a work in progress. Thank you.
Harold, thank you very much indeed for those remarks. And finally, Dr. Rowan Williams, who is Master of, you've got to pronounce it differently between Oxford and Cambridge, don't you? No, Magdalen, is that Magdalen? Magdalen College, Cambridge, and of course until 2012, Archbishop of Canterbury. Rowan.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say a few words about religious education in general to start with, then a little bit about religious schools as institutions, and time permitting, perhaps try and draw out a rather broader question, which I think this discussion raises, of some significance for our social thinking overall. So let's start out with a few thoughts on religious education. It does seem to me that this would be a very strange time in the history of the world to cut back on our attention to how religion works in societies and cultures. Whereas we have in this country, as we've been reminded, what seems to be a very clear trend away from public religious commitment, that certainly isn't the case across the globe, rather the contrary, if anything. If we're preparing people to be citizens not just of this country, but of the world, then informed attention to that global setting is surely one of the things we have to focus on with as much intelligence and resource as we can. So I'd see our discussion as framed against that global background. It's not simply about how many people under 25 go to church in Basingstoke, so to speak. It really is a rather bigger issue. And if we're doing our job as educators, we will want people to understand something of that wider world we live in. And that means, of course, not taking it completely for granted, but the social trends of the North Atlantic world are irreversible and infallible. But that's another story. But what then should religious education involve? For me, there are two major issues here, which I rather agree with Adam, we're not coping with very well in our current practices of religious education. First of all, I believe that a good religious education, an education about religious affairs, is one that helps people understand the motivation of religious believers. Not just what they do, and not just the systems that they operate with, but something about the interiority of it. What does it feel like to be a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Christian, whatever? Because unless we understand that element of motivation, that affective and imaginative element, as well as the sociological and the intellectual, then actually we won't really be equipping people for understanding the world we're in, because understanding the world we're in has to be something to do with understanding where people are coming from, emotionally, imaginatively, effectively, and so forth. And the second thing, again, echoes something that Adam said, and that is, I believe, a good religious education scheme will show how religion is used to think with and feel with in a whole variety of settings. We very easily restrict religion, in this sense, to a silo. But in fact, for most of the history of mankind, and in quite a lot of the social geography of the globe at the moment, religion is not in a silo. It acts as an inspiration, a guide, a source of images, a source of ideals, and so forth. How does religion work itself out in the cultures we're confronted with, and the history of our own culture? So the notion of, I think your phrase, Adam, was distributed learning about religion, is one that I very much warm to. And I think that that is something which can reasonably be addressed by those who have conventional religious faith and those who don't, as part of looking at what a humane, in the widest sense, humanistic education might be about. Understanding motivation, understanding how it runs through a whole range of different areas of the human imagination. Religion, to use the phrase again, as something people use to think with. I want to move on now to a few remarks on religious schools. or schools of religious character, or faith schools, or whatever you want to call them. And in this, I think we are, as has been admitted, in something of a model, as indeed the whole area of religious education is in a model at the moment. But it's a model which has a lot to do with history. And having just said that I think we ought to look at how religion has woven itself into cultural history, the existence of schools of religious character, the existence certainly of church schools in this country, is unintelligible without the history. And part of that history is that differing religious groups, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, took the primary responsibility for a lot of people's education. There was already in the 19th century deep resistance in some quarters to the idea that the Church of England should have a monopoly on this. And that was the source of quite a lot of controversy, which the 1944 Act was in part designed to resolve, and which in its day it resolved relatively successfully. But what that means is that it's not as though at some point there was a nice, clear, secular national system of education, which was then unhappily complicated by a lot of tiresome religious people coming in and messing it up. It's that there was a steady, slow move towards universal education in which religious bodies, primarily the British churches, played a very significant role. And that means that part of our history in this country is of partnership between the state and religious bodies in the provision of education. And really how you describe this depends a lot on where you're sitting. You can describe it from one point of view as the state subsidizing education of a religious character. You can describe it from another point of view as religious bodies providing structures and networks to the cause of universal national education. And I guess that's one of those shot silk issues where your angle determines very much how you'll see it. But part of what that means, I think, is that the partnership, to use Farid's stressed word here, the partnership between faith communities and government in the provision of education is potentially quite a positive thing. Because what this does is to make sure that the education sponsored by and organized by religious bodies is quite properly exposed to public tests of professional integrity and effectiveness. Part of the importance of the system as we have it is, I suppose, that there's nowhere for religions to hide. And if religious bodies believe they have something to say into the public sphere, it's important that in the saying of it, they are fully aware of what they're accountable to in the public sphere, which, as Andrew's reminded us, is no longer a setting where religious credibility is taken for granted. So I'm still very much persuaded that it's possible for schools of religious character to work out and show that kind of partnership, a mainstreaming, if you like, of religious commitment which prevents it retreating into ghettos of various kinds. Religious commitment exposing itself to some public tests and, we hope, offering, proposing to not just to students but to a wider public the possibility of religion being something you think with. So not nearly as negative as some think, and I'm still very unpersuaded that religious schools as such are a contributor to social division. There will be debate about that, I've no doubt. But those are the grounds on which I'd want to defend something like the system we've got at the moment. I don't want to comment in detail at this point on issues about compulsory public acts of worship. I have some serious doubts about the credibility of the way that currently is done right across the board, in and out of schools of religious character, to be frank. And that's not a ditch I particularly want to die in. But maybe more of that later on. I think I may have a minute or so to add just one final remark, which is of a more general character, and which is a kind of footnote to something I hinted at earlier. As I said, it's not the case that once upon a time there was a nice, reasonable, universalist, secular system which religion came along and complicated. Secularity, secularism, is not, historically speaking, the default setting for human beings. And I'm very wary of any system or any practice which suggests that everybody, or at least most sensible people, are really secular. But unfortunately, there are these minorities for which we have to make provision. The case is, I think, more that the secular environment, which we have hammered out in a country like this, is a way of preventing any one community of conviction gaining or preserving a monopoly in the public sphere, a way in which we've allowed a degree, a limited, still rather limited degree, but a degree of willingness to allow religions to argue and engage in public, to be candid about, for people to be candid about their commitments and their motivations, not to regard religion as simply a matter of private eccentricity. Is secularity something you start with or something you finish with? My view is that it's something you finish with as a way of holding the ring between very diverse, increasingly diverse communities in a society like ours. And therefore, one kind of secularity is, I think, entirely acceptable to people of religious conviction like myself. The kind of secularity I have a problem with is the kind that says, effectively, most sensible people are not religious. Therefore, religiousness has no legitimate place in public discussion. And that's where I do begin to scratch my head, rather. So that's, in a nutshell, where I'd see a constructive philosophy of religious education moving forward, the role I'd still see for schools of religious character in a society like ours, and just a little bit of the broader social/philosophical background against which I'd want to argue these things.
Rowan, thank you very much indeed. Now, we hold your applause. Hold your applause, all at the end. Someone almost did it at the back. We'll have a short discussion here because I do want the panel to come back on each other a little. We do have a diversity of opinion here before opening it out. And seems to me that the one thing we can sort of agree on is that some form of religious education through classes, whether it's humanist-driven or whether it's with a focus perhaps more than 45 minutes on different religious and faith ideas, is important, and it's important in the modern society. The question is whether religious schools, state-funded religious schools or independent religious schools, are the best placed to do that. And it seems to me that they're two quite different things. We can agree on the former, maybe not on the latter. And the second thing is, what actually is a religious school? Because oftentimes you will find that it is not about what's in the curriculum, but merely the residential concentration of an area. And it has a certain religious makeup, but actually it is a state school. It's not a religious school at all, but may have a sort of feel of a particular religion. And again, are we sort of worried about that? And if we are worried about that, surely that is something that really stretches some way beyond the national curriculum, but is about housing concentration in certain areas. So I'd like the panel maybe start over with you, Andrew, about your reflection on that.
Well, I think you're right to note that a commitment to education in state schools about different religions and beliefs is almost universal now, and it's been a big change actually. If you looked at not just in the poll that there's been commissioned today, but if you look at a longer sort of series of data, you see that's actually increasing. And the more that younger people have experienced the sort of RE that is taught now in schools, which is it's not perfect. You might even think it's not very good, but it's a lot better than what was happening sort of 50 or 60 years ago. The more people are committed to it and wanting it in public schools. I think you're right. I think that's a point of almost social consensus, or social almost consensus, rather. I think that the question, instead of what constitutes a religious school, whether you're a critic of such schools or a defender of such schools, is, as you've said, the more interesting one. Now, I think that the state-funded religious schools, which are to be opposed and which I would like to see phased out, could be defined by being schools that admit their pupils selectively on the basis of parental religion, that teach a syllabus that is designed to be confessional and instructive in a particular worldview, rather than to teach about a range of different religions' beliefs in a broad and balanced and objective way, and schools which do the same thing within their worship or assemblies or whatever. So if there are religious schools like that within the state system, if there are religious schools that don't do any of those things within the state system, I think the case against them is much weaker. Then you'd have to mount a case which sort of is generally bad for the signal it sent about division within society.
So would it be your contention that a good, broad, diverse religious education is not best delivered by a faith school that is premised on some of those single faith?
Yes,
single faith.
Absolutely, I would say that. I would argue that completely.
Could you respond to that point, whether you agree or disagree with that?
Yes. The trouble is, I think, if you say there's no confessional content at all in what's available in the school and no act of specific worship, then exactly what particular religious character the school has becomes rather harder to define, to my mind. That's why you like them, I'm sure. But it seems to me that it's possible, it should be possible, I believe it is possible, for schools to maintain a visible ethos of connection with religious communities, to make good and constructive use of the networks they have in a neighbourhood, and not to indoctrinate or overwhelm children in a divisive or problematic way. And I believe that partly because I've seen it done. The old chestnut about the chap who asks a theological student, "Do you believe in infant baptism?" And he says, "Believe it, I've seen it done." So I have seen schools like this work, and work particularly in areas of some social pressure and privation, where helpful networks, helpful adults who will come in and support, are not in huge supply, and churches and other religious communities can be a real plus there. So I'm more sanguine about the possibility of that being working constructively.
But I think there's nothing unique about that. Community schools in settings could offer the same sort of thing, and in fact might draw on a wider pool. I don't think there's anything wrong with religious people and religious groups getting involved in their local school, especially going in, supporting people. I think that's great. I think a whole community should be involved in the life of the school, but are wider than just one particular religious denomination. I think that maybe we can agree about the selective admissions. I don't know what anyone else thinks about that.
Well. We have the professor here who specializes. We have the professor here who studies this stuff. So maybe we'll pass over to you.
I'd never defer to an archbishop, of course. I think the complication here is that I do think that religion and belief are best taught away from the heat of the concerns about confessionalism and so on. And I'd much rather there were no faith schools or schools with a religious character at all, frankly. But we're not starting from the ideal. We're starting, as Rowan says, from a position where the welfare state could never have afforded a sudden universalism of state education and had to bring forth all that had gone before, which was primarily church schools. They're part of the mix, and if they weren't in the mix, we simply wouldn't be able to educate all the young people in the country. The problem that then produces is one that I think is perfectly understandable from one point of view, which is that faith schools, as opposed to schools of a religious character, the Church of England and Catholic schools, the new faith schools that come in under the free schools structure, I think are a reaction to the fact that there are so many Christian schools in the country. And it's that reactionism that I think makes it so bad-tempered, and that's really unfortunate. I think it's fair enough, actually, that people of religious traditions which are newer to Britain want to have their slice of the educational cake as well.
I'm sorry, what do you mean reaction? In what way? In what way? A sense that if you have one, we should have one?
Absolutely, yes. If you've got Christian schools, why shouldn't I have an Islamic one? I do think it's fair enough, but as Rowan also says, they've got to be subject to the same political tests and scrutiny as all the other schools. And here we have a really practical problem, because the scrutineers themselves, as we saw with Ofsted in Birmingham a year or two back, need themselves to be experts at looking at this well. And frankly, there's an issue there.
So are you suggesting that it's rather to be subject to those same standards that Ofsted sets across the board in minority faith schools is harder, it's more difficult because Ofsted inspectors don't know as much about what's happening?
Well, if you accept my thesis that there's a pretty poor quality of conversation about religion and belief in general, then that would apply to Ofsted inspectors too. And if they're bad at the generalism of religion and belief, they're going to be even worse, we can assume, at the specificity required of understanding Islam.
Well, fortunately, to my right, we have, well, you're the director of the Centre of Research and Evaluation in Muslim Education, so you're probably well placed to directly answer this. The extent to which, yes, the evaluation of Muslim schools in particular is rather difficult. Has it been done well? As my understanding is that there's actually a tiny number of Muslim faith-based schools, maybe only a dozen or so in the country at the last count. Although, as I said, that's often confused with a kind of sense that a school is of a religious nature because of where it exists.
Well, just on the numbers, I think there are about 150 schools that see themselves as schools of religious character and Muslim religious character, and they have registered themselves as Muslim schools, as faith schools. So there are many schools who are actually community schools or even Christian faith schools, but have majority Muslims. But that's different. There are about 150 schools which see themselves as faith schools. Out of them, about 15 or 16 have got public funding. So the public funding number is small, but independent Muslim schools are large in numbers. I think that I would agree with Adam when he said that to some extent the emergence of Muslim schools was a reaction to several things. One, it was an equity issue, that if they have, others have got it, they should get it. Also, many Muslims felt that the kind of religious identity they wanted to give to their children was not coming forth in the community schools or other faith schools. But I think to some extent, we also need to bring in that across the world, if you look at the Muslim societies from Indonesia to Tunisia, there is a rise in religiosity, in the public demonstration of Islamic symbols, whether it is hijab or whether it is beard or any other. And that has also affected, and many of the Muslim schools are also a reflection of this, to some extent at least, genuine rise of religiosity that we see across the Muslim world. Now, coming back to the question you had asked, I personally think that it's not just the Ofsted, but I think for many Muslims themselves who are running the schools, I think their own understanding of Islam and religion is, in my view, deeply problematic in the sense that they start a school, but it's really not the education that is their first and foremost concern, but it's the formation of religious identity. We call these schools as Islamic schools and Muslim schools, but actually none of them is a Muslim school in the sense that they are teaching about Islam or Muslims broadly. They're all denominational schools. They are schools divided by Shia or Sunni, or even within Sunnis, Deobandis or Brelvis. They are denominational schools, but we usually don't use these terms. And I think they have some of them are doing very well. They are using national curriculum, and therefore they are providing a decent education to their students, but many we have issues, and particularly in subjects like literature, in arts, and some others. And I think the view that I was presenting earlier, that we need to move from focusing on trying to present religion as a finished product that ought to be given and therefore nurturing identity, we ought to move to focus on people who are religious, and therefore the need to bring out the diversity in which people hold different motivation and the ways in which they think, as earlier mentioned. And I think this way of approaching religion can apply to faith schools as well. It will be quite difficult for them in the current mode of way in which they are approaching. But I believe that when it comes to religion and education, in an educational establishment, is the education that should come first and not the religious ideals.
Come back on that.
Could I just say a word about that? I welcome that because I think it's no part of any school's objective to form a religious identity as such, I think. It may be legitimately part of a school's identity to offer the resources of religious identity, but not to compel, which is why, coming back to your question, Andrew, I'm wary of exclusive religious tests here, and the way in which they currently operate is not particularly impressive in many ways, but I take comfort from the fact that quite a lot of, well, our own Anglican schools are used to this, I suppose. Quite a lot of such schools do assume that the majority of students coming in will not be of that confession. It'll be very interesting, I think, to see as schools of other traditions develop, whether, let's say, a Muslim school at some future date feels confident enough to say, well, you know, we're not being exclusively Muslim. We are happy to be a school with a Muslim ethos and some teaching about that background for Muslim students. We're also prepared to cope with students from quite different backgrounds.
Some academies, the new academies have started to do that. They see themselves as schools based on Muslim ethos but open to others. So in this new trend, you do find very few, but still some schools who are beginning to take
Are there any names that we could... It'd be very interesting to know where those places are. I'd quite like to check those out.
Yes, I can. I mean, I don't remember them right now, but there is one school, for example, which is in north of London and which is based on the. It's called Pictol Academy, and it is based on the. Pictol was one of the converts to Islam, and he did a translation of the Quran as well. And this school is trying to model itself on the ethos and inspiration from the life of this Pictol person, but is very open to others as well.
Okay, can I just, before we open it out, a very quick but potentially quite important question to you. Be very brief with it, but it's the actual academic performance of these schools, because we're not just talking about the religious formation or identity. It's also how good are they at producing results. And I know the evidence on this is actually rather more difficult to collect than you might think. But given we've got a very good panel here, I'd be very interested to know briefly, I mean, how good are faith schools just as schools, simply as schools producing good scores in maths and English and all the rest?
I think a brief answer is not really any better than any others in the sense of value added. I mean, I think most research would demonstrate that where some state religious schools outperform at the level of, for example, examination results, other state schools, it mostly can be explained by the socioeconomic effect, the people that they get through the door as a result of religious selection.
Adam.
Well, just to add that that may be the case, but nevertheless they're often more popular, the research shows, because they're perceived to outperform on the basis of having a
they do get better results,
an ethos.
but they do get better results, but that's because of the people they get through the door.
Yes, and that's the complication here. It's very nice to be able to say that schools of religious character tend to outperform, but that's because there is certainly in some areas, I wouldn't say in all, but in some, that covert selection, because precisely it's an upward spiral. It's people perceiving good results, wanting to send children to schools that deliver good results, and so on and so forth. I say it's not true universally because I know enough state-funded religious schools in deprived areas to know that it's not entirely a matter of that dynamic, and doesn't have to be, but I recognize the ambiguity about these.
Okay, and briefly?
Yes, in fact, this causes a very interesting dilemma for schools, with faith schools, because often you would see, and I can talk about Muslim schools in particular, that if you look at their motivations of establishing the school, often they would use the language that we are concerned about the growing materialism, consumerism, greed, all these factors. And yet, if the results are very good, their students end up in good universities and ultimately end up in the same economic system that they in the beginning were opposed to. And I think this is, last week I was at a conference organized by Church of England's Education Department on character education, and this issue, the tension between academic achievement and character formation came up because we are operating in a largely capitalist society. So the success actually means you go back to the same system that you first used the faith to argue against.
Okay. Unless you're a member of the prosperity gospel belief, in which case it fits very neatly indeed.
If I could I just add one very, very brief thought? It's not just about religious schools. Speaking as a Welshman, Welsh language medium schools in Wales work very like religious schools in the sense they have extremely good academic results, partly because I think they are the church schools of contemporary Wales. That's the same reason.
Okay, I would like to open this out to the audience. So do we have a roving microphone? Here they are. Brilliant. And we have some rovers with those mics. So let me take a couple at a time. I saw a hand up over here, I think. Was it you, madam? No, everyone's looking behind them. I'm sorry, I've sent you on a wild goose chase. Gentleman in the middle with the high visibility jacket, and then the lady down at the front here. Yeah, it did work, that jacket.
Thanks. A quick question really for Andrew Copson. This statement you threw out quite early about how in 5 or 6 years' time there's going to be Andrew Brown from The Guardian.
I thought it was Andrew Brown.
Yes. About in 5 or 6 years there's going to be more Catholics than Anglicans. Have you got any basis for that? Because I don't know any polling that will show that up. Yeah. I mean, unless you're simply counting Sunday attendance, which is not, I think, a fair measure in these circumstances.
I'll try and Google it for you, Andrew. Okay. If I can't find it now, I'll send it to you afterwards. But yes, it's certainly... Well, that would be unfair to ask him to comment, but I think I'll look it up for you, Andrew.
Okay, and while you're looking, I think Google needs to be used more in these discussions. So feel free in the audience to also Google some facts that you're hearing and check them. Don't trust everything you read on the internet, though. Lady down at the front.
This is 60 words, premise first and then the question, and it's about how to bring all religions and humanism together.
All right, very easy. 60 words, go ahead.
All right. So Sigmund Freud said that God was a genetic idea, and there are good reasons for thinking that God is a genetic, psychological, cultural idea. That all those things contribute to why people have this idea of God. Okay. So the question is it time to stop telling children in all religions that there is an actual God and to get them to begin to think in a complex way about the complexities of the idea of God, because it's that divisive idea that is splitting everybody and has power.
Right. We've gone quite meta about whether we should even be teaching religion at all, I suppose. Well, I think that's one for you.
Yes. I have to say my short answer to the particular way in which you phrase the question is no, because I actually believe in God. And that for me, believing in God is not believing about the way my mind works. It is, incidentally, believing about how my mind works, but it's not just that. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, back to the finished product point that was made earlier, that doesn't mean that teaching about God is as straightforward as teaching about an object in the world. It isn't, because God is not an object in the world, whatever else we say about God. So that's where I want to go back to the 2 points I made in the first bit of my presentation. How does it actually feel? What do people really think they're doing, and how does it work? And how is it used to think with? Now, I don't think we can cut the Gordian knot here by saying, let's all agree that it's just something about how the mind works. It may be that, but those who have faith actually think it's rather more than that. And I don't think you can commit an educational system, a statutory educational system, to working on the basis of belief that God is real. But a statutory educational system which did not work with the assumption that there are quite a lot of people around who do believe God is real is not doing its job.
Can I just follow up quickly on that? I mean, to what extent, though, should governments be deciding what is taught about certain religions? And I have that with half an eye on the current debate about extremism and school and the extent to which certain doctrines should or should not be taught because they're not, beneficial for the public realm or whatever. We do intervene. We do intervene in the specifics of it. I mean, should we?
I think we're on a very slippery slope indeed if we have government doing theology for us and trying to determine clearly what's acceptable and unacceptable, simply in terms of religious language generally. What is taught in school, as I say, has to be exposed to public tests. And that's I think, where the question of acceptability comes in.
Did you get your Googling
Yeah,
answer?
there you go. Okay, so last year in the British Social Attitudes Survey, you're looking at about 16% Anglicans, just under 10% Catholics. Catholics going up because of immigration. Anglican, British Social Attitudes Survey, people saying they were Anglican, they associated with that denomination. No, Church of England. So 16% Church of England. I'll give you the figures I'm working with. 16% Church of England, 10% Roman Catholic. Catholics through immigration are increasing. Anglicans are dying. Sorry, but they are. Especially from well, yes, we all are. That's true. But Anglicans more quickly than most, and so because they're older. They're older.
This is getting really personal.
And so they'll cross over. I mean, I'll buy you a drink in 6 years' time if it hasn't happened. But that's the basis of my calculation.
If you manage to get out, you'll buy him a drink. Your question was repeated sort of by somebody online. I'm just going to so people know that I am monitoring the Twitter. Someone said, if education is about objective critical thinking, then why shouldn't religion in schools be taught simply as a powerful social construct to be critiqued along with any other? A sort of version of a more delicate version of your question, if I may say. What do you think about that?
Well, yes, but I'd also question the claim that education is as objective as it says it is. It tries to be, fair enough, and it probably should try to be, but actually the educational curricula across disciplines is already stuffed full of social norms. That heterosexuality is normal, that capitalism is normal, that economics is important, that employability is a driving force of what we do in schools. These are actually norms, and we might agree with them, we might not, but we shouldn't just say that they're objective and that's the end of that then.
It doesn't mean we should accept more norms, though, does it?
It means that we should uncover our norms if we're going to be critical as well as more critical, less objective, I would say.
Okay. This is what always happens. I didn't catch the order. They all seem to go up at the same time. We have a gentleman in the blue shirt there, and I think you were next, but I've got you noted down for the next one, madam.
The philosopher John Hick had a helpful definition of what makes for a significant world religion, which was one that has fostered at least one civilization. If we turn that around, can we name a civilization that has not been fostered, has not sprung forth from a religious tradition system? So in order to use religion in education to think with, how could we look at the world without looking at what was behind the formation of everything around us?
Okay, yeah. Hold that thought, panelists. And over here.
A number of you referred to the muddle that you thought characterised RE at the moment in schools. Would it be better if religious education were made part of the national curriculum so that the same subject was, the same content was taught to all pupils in any part of England, and whether they went to a school with a religious character or a community school?
That's a rather good question.
Very good question.
Right. So I've just finished a research project which reports next month on partly exactly this question. And we talked to students, parents, teachers, employers, and what they all said was, we want a broader idea of religion and belief in our school RE. We're not that clear whether we want it compulsorily or optional, that's a different question. But we do want some kind of national framework or guidance that helps us to understand what's the content, what's the structure, what's the purpose. Now, the problem we've got here, of course, is that the national curriculum doesn't actually apply to free schools or academies, which are becoming the majority of schools. So there's a bigger structural political question there, but there's a definite appetite for a national something.
Scotland has one, and it works perfectly well.
Would you answer?
Yes, I agree. I think the current method of devising the syllabus is deeply problematic. I think religious studies scholars and scholars of various religions ought to be part of designing religious studies curriculum, and it should therefore have the same epistemological status in some ways as other subjects have, and should be part of the national curriculum.
But how are we going to do that if the majority of schools are going to become free schools or academies, and so they can sort of teach what they want?
But that then becomes a problem of the national curriculum itself, because then even you have to leave science, geography, history, everything. So that's a different issue. But the point here is that whatever national curriculum is teaching, and at the moment it's still teaching to the most of the students, and whatever standards you have for creating history curriculum, geography curriculum, should be the standards for creating religious curriculum as well. Whether or not then, because of the free schools and academies, we are able to teach it to a number of students is a different question. And that's the question about what should be the core knowledge, skills, and attitudes that we should develop as citizens in our country. And that's a debate about who decides what knowledge should be there. But to the extent there's national curriculum, I think religious education should be part of that.
Okay. Take either that one or this gentleman's more philosophical question.
A brief remark on the curriculum then, but if I can squeeze in a remark of applause for what was said up there. I agree. I think, though, there is now this problem about the whole idea of a national curriculum. And if I were to put my cards on the table here, I'd have to say I think there's been an enormous resignation of responsibility in the race for free schools in terms of comparability, justice, general sort of equity and standards of intelligibility in education across the country. And I really have some worries about that. And there's going to have to be some structural way of dealing with this. I would certainly welcome national standards for religious education. As Andrew said, it works in other places. No reason why it shouldn't work here. Meanwhile, since free schools and academies are not going to go away overnight, we have to ask what are the pressures that can be put on to secure some kind of voluntary concordat or protocol on approaching this. And I don't know exactly what Adam's report's going to be saying, but I hope it'll nudge us towards that.
And you had a philosophical remark.
Oh, just to say yes.
Oh, right. Brevity is the soul of wit.
I think that's right. I agree with everything that Rowan said and Adam has said too. And I think that actually within the wider RE world, all the organisations involved in RE, I think are slowly coming to agreement with that too. There should be a national curriculum, at the very least, national scheme or framework for religious education in England. There will very soon be one in Wales, it's almost certain. There is already one in Scotland. It's not beyond the wit of legislators in England to do the same. And I don't think even that free schools and academies are such an insuperable obstacle as some people might fear, because they all have agreements that could be amended such that they would have to follow this. And in fact, the great persuasive value of a national document should be taken into account, which might mean they would follow it anyway simply for ease. So I don't think it's too... And reputational concern as well. And parents who increasingly will look on schools' websites to see what they're teaching in advance of making their decisions about which schools to apply for their children will expect to see that.
Just to combine the two questions a little.
Oh, yeah.
Inform, a research group at the London School of Economics, which looks at cults and sort of new religious movements, it calls them, has noted quite a sort of stark increase in the number of new religious movements that are forming, and we had that definition of what a religion is or a faith is earlier. So what if one of these new religious movements, one based on the Jedi or transhumanism or whatever else, decides to start a faith-based, applies for a faith-based state-funded school or a free, or sets up a free school? What should the government do about that?
Well, you don't need, it's not a hypothetical question. I mean, there are such applications all the time, and there are still applications at the moment. And I think the government is going to be in an extremely difficult position in this as in other areas of law where they've set a very low bar. For marriage, for example, so I mean, any religious organisation with premises in England and Wales can apply to have legal marriages, which means that there's something called the Aetherius Society in England and Wales that believes that there are literally alien gods on the moon or Mars, I can't remember which, watching over us on a daily basis that can now perform legal marriages. If they applied to set up a school, I think it would be extremely difficult for the government to resist, which is one of the things that sort of illustrates the nonsense, I would say, of faith schools generally, which is that we're very willing to entertain schools run along lines that are sort of sanctioned by the patina of history, but not newer organisations which really have beliefs that are just as credible.
Brief. You have to have a right of response to this, Rowan. I did want to throw it back out, but at least a
not
right of
necessarily in that specific example.
Thank you. I'm an agnostic about about extraterrestrials. I realise that the criteria for being a serious religion are not entirely watertight or very impressive. They boil down to it mustn't be too silly, and that's not quite what we need in this context. But to answer the specific point, there is actually something not completely ridiculous about saying the patina of history is one of the things that makes you take something seriously, and that the claim of a new religious movement to be taken on the same level has to be subject to the test of history in a way. We know roughly what we can expect from Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc., etc. We don't much know what we can expect in terms of civilization funding capacity from the Jedi. Unless, of course, there are extraterrestrials and the Aetherius Society is right.
Okay, I'm going to open this back out again for... I had you down next, didn't I? I'd already promised that. Yes. And a question down here, and I've got you down for the next one. Where are the microphones, please? So, lady down here. And then a lady over here.
I've got serious worries about Professor Williams's idea of a broader education of religious people, and I accept that completely. I think we should be exposed to people that are religious and understand how they think and what they do, and that creates two problems for me. The first, of course, is that you are preaching to the quote-unquote converted within the faith schools. You are not expanding that, really. And secondly, who do you think is going to actually provide that sort of education? I recently trained as a teacher. I'm no longer a teacher, I should say. I had to teach religious education to both primary and secondary schools. I'm an atheist and I specialise in maths. It's like me trying to teach music. The only exposure that the pupils in my school had for any understanding of how religion worked was from other pupils. Mm-hmm. And so my view is that faith schools stop that. They don't allow an understanding. And even as an atheist, I think absolutely we should have exposure to people with different faiths and try and have some, if not empathy, mild understanding of what's going on there. And I think faith schools stop that in its tracks.
Okay, hold your fire on a response to that because we have another question.
Yes, I had a sense that all of you seem to think that what is valuable here is what is good for society, not necessarily what is good for the family nor for the individual. I think that a free school, a private school, any school where you have conviction and where you teach the children to know who they are in their background, who they are in their religious identity, where they come from, I think that is also something that builds society. If you want to have, if you look at big society and you don't look at the individuals and the families, I feel like you're missing a big point.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask, I think probably both Andrew and Adam to answer that second question, and then Rowan on the first, and if you'd like to come in on the first one as well. So,
I think a two-part answer to that last question. Firstly, I think that when we're talking about state-funded schools, which is what I am exclusively talking about, I think it is legitimate to apply social tests to them. I think it is a legitimate question to say what for wider society will work in terms of the schools that society is funding. So I think that's a legitimate question. I agree with you, however, that it can't be the only part, and in terms of the curriculum, perhaps it's not the major part. And one of the reasons why I think that restrictive confessional syllabuses are wrong is because they deny children their full development potential, because I want young children to be exposed to as many different sorts of views and values as possible as they decide for themselves what their own worldview is and what it will be. And so I think that what you're really describing is a different view from mine in terms of what development means for young people as they grow up in school. I think that more... I mean, I have a liberal view of education, obviously, which is that I see it as the process whereby children become, mature in all sorts of ways, including in their own values and worldview. I don't think that the major part of that should be inculcation into a worldview that happens to be shared by their parents. And I think that if parents do want to do that, as some parents will wish to do, and perhaps no parent can escape doing to some measure, then I think they should do it not within a state-funded school, but within their own home or community institutions.
Would you like to come back on that, madam, or is that satisfactory?
Well, I don't quite agree with you, obviously.
Well, we disagree, I agree.
Yes, we disagree on a few things, because I think that if you have a well-defined religious heritage and you have your own identity, that is when you can meet other people with other faiths and not be afraid. I feel many people they don't know who they are. And when they meet someone with a strong faith, they become angry and afraid.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, give your own children the faith in the beginning. And of course, I'm a Christian, so I would suggest the Christian faith.
I mean, there is ample psychological evidence on this subject. It is controversial. It does, to some extent, go both ways. You're certainly right to say that strong values and a strong sense of identity have certain benefits in terms of socialization and ability to not be afraid of the other. But so too can strong identities fuel conflict and hostility. And I think that the jury is out on which is the most likely to occur.
Adam.
Well, I think this goes to the heart of the complete lack of clarity there is about what RE is for. So you hit the nail on the head with your question in many ways. Just in brackets to say that the question of whether one of its purposes is to produce harmony or peace, well, does knowing about other religions necessarily lead us to tolerating them better anyway? No, we don't know whether that is the case, so I would challenge that. But I'd also say this is absolutely, for me, what drives why we need to be clear about what RE is for. And I would say that it needs to be in schools for equipping all of us for ordinary daily encounter with a pervasive plurality of religion or belief in workplaces and in social settings and so on, with as little norm bringing about that as possible, that it's not about citizenship or cohesion, it's just for being equipped for the encounter that we then bring ourselves to. I'd then say that the role of the family is very much, that is the place, I think, where the confessional stuff happens. And if we could be clear about what does happen in schools, we'd be clearer that the confessional stuff isn't what it's helpful to put into the school space. The final thing I'd say about that is, if we could be clear about that, then we could do something I'd really like to call for, which is abolish the right for parents to withdraw children from school RE. I don't think that's appropriate at all, but I understand why people feel at the moment, in the muddle, they might want to do that.
Rowan, there's a question directed at you, the first question from the woman here.
And a very interesting question indeed, I think, or two questions, as I understood it. One was about who provides this broader religious education, and you described your experience. I've come across exactly that in so many contexts, and it does worry me that the last 2 or 3 decades have seen a pretty systematic deprofessionalizing of religious education in schools.
Demographics are against you as well, because the younger
Yes.
coming through are absolutely not religious, to be honest.
But that's not the point. I think that the point is whether you're able to offer a proper professional training as an educator in this area, never mind your own convictions. I mean, you know, you could do it with the training.
And as
but I can't give any understanding or empathy
well,
somebody who does
but that,
things for religious purposes, because I'm not that person. People have to meet.
could you use the microphone? Sorry.
Sorry. I can do the facts. I'm perfectly capable of doing that. And I can go through the process. And I did get a few sessions, to be honest. I trained quite recently. I've stopped teaching now. I got a few sessions on how to teach it. I can teach the facts, but that's not the point I'm making at all. The point I'm making is I cannot understand religion. I have that exposure. I cannot give any understanding or empathy. I can try to, but the only real exposure that the pupils will have is from other pupils, really, and we can discuss it, and I'm very happy to broaden that conversation. Yep. But by faith schools, you're taking them away from them. You're making it, you know, in a sense, secular, aren't you? I appreciate that's not quite true, but the proportions are significant. And I can't see how it works.
I'm not persuaded that faith, this is the second question really, I'm not persuaded that faith schools take that away. I've seen
pupils, not all the pupils, clear. Not all the pupils, but the majority of pupils who have strong faiths tend to, if they can, go to faith schools. And it's the strong faith, let's be honest, that's the issue here.
That can also mean, of course, that people will go to a strong faith school even if it's not from their own faith. And that produces, again, I've seen this at work very effectively in some areas.
I'm deeply cynical about faith schools, so yes.
But that means that doesn't block off the empathy. Some might say that I'd rather my children were in a school where somebody knows at least why it matters than in another kind of school. And that's, as a matter of fact.
I'm going to have to stop that conversation because, Ferry, would you like to come in?
Yes, just one point on the issue of the identity that was discussed. I think, yes, a strong identity is important, but it can also be dangerous. The uncritical conviction that one might have about one's own identity. I am thinking of Amartya Sen's excellent book, Identity and Violence, in which he brings this up. So I think alongside the nurturing of identity, there should also be a nurturing of a critical distance with your own tradition and identity so that you can scrutinize it and not simply take it as a given, which is cause of some of the problems that we see around us. And the last point I would say on this issue, I think no one can really know about anybody's motivation or really interiority directly. We don't have access to it. The only way we can have access to it, the only interiority we have access to is ourselves. Otherwise, it's only through what people have produced, what they have written, rituals they have created, what architecture or text they have created. And that's why I think the exposure to a religious culture is more important and what people have produced. I don't think we have access. It's an indirect access. If you expose your students, let's say, to literature produced by mystics, that is the only way they can have access, if they have any access, to the interiority. You can't directly give access. That's not possible. So that's a limitation of any humanities that we have.
I think there's a bigger breakdown here, though, of actually having faith and not having faith. You see what I mean? There is much more than a mystic or a Catholic or it's having faith and not having faith.
Okay, we're running out of time, I'm afraid. I'd love to carry that one on. And there was an arm raise that I spotted, which was you here, madam. Maybe we've got time for one more question. You'd already had a question, I'm afraid. Maybe you in the back, madam, as well, because you're near to the microphone. So you, and then we'll go back to the panel.
It relates a little bit to what the panel was talking about the purpose of RE. It might be a bit out of date now, but a couple of years ago when I was doing my teacher training, I remember looking at sort of government guidance about what RE is supposed to do. And one of the things it states is that it has a special role in the spiritual development of young people. And because of the background that I'm from, I find that attractive, and that's part of why I'm an RE teacher. But I also wonder whether that adds to perhaps the muddle that some of you were referring to. So, yeah, I wonder what you will think about.
Very good question. Yeah.
I think the debate today presupposes the question, well, what are the aims of education itself? And I was just wondering, in the context of faith schools, which are obviously informed by a particular religious ideology or a particular conception of a religion, how can faith schools ensure that students are given the freedom and encouragement to conduct their own critical inquiry and sort of reach their own conclusions as to their faith or lack thereof?
Okay. Let me, Adam, would you take perhaps this first question about that, whether that contributes to the muddle?
Yes.
And anyone else jump in as well, of course.
Yeah, certainly. I'm most struck by what you said about it having a special role in spirituality, and I want to respond to that by saying I don't think RE should have a special role in anything. But unfortunately, I think it is called upon to bear the burden of all sorts of special things, like citizenship and cohesion and sorting out the whole problem of tension between religious people and between religious people and others. And I just don't think that's what it should be for at all.
Okay.
On that,
yeah.
I mean, I think that every subject in the curriculum obviously has a role in contributing towards spiritual development, which broadly, I think the best definition ever of spiritual in the spiritual development in the Ofsted guidance was the attribution of meaning to experience, which is one of the definitions they give in their inspection guidance, or used to anyway. I think that it's pretty obvious then that the extent to which RE contributes to that in you or not as a pupil will depend on the extent to which you're going to get that out of religions in your life. And I think, for me, that's one of the things which perhaps needs to change about that subject. I would love it if that subject, RE or name something else, did make a special contribution to the spiritual development of every child. I think at the moment it doesn't. I think a non-religious child at the moment is more likely to get their spiritual development in that sense from other parts of the curriculum, music, English, history, wherever else. And I think that's a shame.
Right, now, I'm going to have to close the Q&A section off, I'm afraid, because we are running out of time, and I want each panelist to just in 1 minute or 90 seconds reflect maybe on just one thing that you've taken from this discussion that you hadn't considered before, or if there isn't just one thing or one remark, do try to I suppose restate your position in light of what you've heard today. And I wonder if we could go backwards in the order that we did the panel as traditional. So, Rowan, we'll start with you.
I was very struck with what Farid said about religion as a finished product and the assumption that we sometimes make, whether as believers or unbelievers, that this is something settled and packaged. I think that questioning about religion is one of the things human beings do and ought to be equipped to do more effectively, whatever conclusions they come to. I live in hope that we might yet devise ways of enabling people who don't themselves have deep conviction of a religious kind to get sufficiently inside in order to allow that to happen. Because that, to me, connects with the aims of education overall question. I hope that the aims of education overall are to shape a response to society and the world that is mature, informed, unafraid, and deeply, deeply resourced in whatever way is possible. The religious traditions of our world are clearly, to me, part of that. That's what I hope for from education in general and religious education in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think 3 quick points. One is, to me, this discussion has highlighted the importance of going back to the very purpose and philosophy of religious education and education more generally. And I think we need to give more time to that fundamental question. Secondly, I think going back to the point that I was trying to make initially is that we need to help young people understand that religion is, even from a believer's point of view, as much about divinity as it is about the human beings themselves and the human-centeredness, the agency of human beings, and their need to interpret and necessity of interpreting text is an important thing that should be part of religious education. The last thing I want to say is that often our discussions, and very important discussions, are there. But there is, I think, another thing that we need to bring in, which sometimes overshadows all of these discussions, and that is the economic shadow on education that is there, the corporatization of higher education that we see. And we noted this earlier, that ultimately the economics aim overtakes sometimes the faith school's own aims as well. And I think this relationship between economics and education has not received enough attention, which perhaps we need to give.
Adam. Okay, 4 things, but all quite brief. All quite brief. My first observation is about how important it is not to be overly preoccupied with the risks and dangers of religion and belief, which are often expressed in concerns about confessionalism, they're legitimate concerns, but also about Islam in general and faith schools in particular. We talked a lot about faith schools in this conversation. So that's my first thing. The second is, I think it's really important that we get as good through our learning about religion and belief, understanding secularity and what we really mean by that, as the context for the conversation in which we talk, the conversation we have about religion and belief, because unless we're good at both, we won't resolve either. The third thing is that nobody has to be religious to teach or learn about religion or belief. In fact, I have a sneaking suspicion that it might be better if they're not. And the fourth thing is, I think this debate is incredibly important at the moment. And Rowan said at the beginning of his comments, it would be a very odd moment to withdraw or resile from the conversation about education about religion and belief when it's so publicly prominent in particularly a part of the world, Europe, which thought it had left that conversation behind. It seems all the more pressing, really. And to pick up on your point about markets in education, the free school market seems to me to be something less than a responsible sort of place in which to try to shape that conversation.
Finally, Andrew.
Well, I'm not as interested in religion as much as I am in, firstly, I think making sure that all children in our schools have the opportunity to develop their own religious or non-religious worldview in an educational setting, which I think is extremely important, because the opportunity to do that in a setting that is additional to the family is something that in Britain, actually, we're extremely lucky to have. One of the problems, I think, in countries that have secular education systems is that religion and belief don't get a fair airing in the classroom in the United States or France or whatever. You don't get the opportunity to engage with those ideas that are different from the ones that you might encounter in the home or community. So I think that that subject in our curriculum is extremely important. I think, though, as I said, it has to change radically to adjust to and cope with the religion or belief of children that find themselves in our classrooms today, which is in line with all the demographic trends that I outlined at the beginning. And secondly, I do want to say something more about religious schools, faith schools, state-funded schools of religious character or whatever, because I think that it's more important than our discussion has indicated, I think, as a really hard intersection between the difficult areas of religion and belief today and our education system. 1 million school places in England are still subject to religious selection. I think in a state that, in a society that wants to see itself as an open and inclusive and dynamic one, that can't carry on. And I think to have an ever-growing percentage of children, especially from minority ethnic backgrounds, segregated into religion-specific schools is extremely damaging for future social cohesion. It's a disastrous experiment which is taking place, in England alone, within the UK and within Europe. And I think it desperately wants to be reversed.
Panellists, thank you. First, before you launch into your thunderous applause that I've been promising you all night, I'd like to thank the people that have been watching at home. I'd like to thank all of you for not only coming, but taking part and asking questions. And before I hand over to Arif, who's going to explain where to go after this if you want to, now is your opportunity to thank the panellists for an excellent discussion. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. There it goes.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Jamie. I'll be very brief. First of all, I'd like us in a moment to thank not only our panellists, but also Jamie for chairing the session so excellently. And also, you needn't clap for this, but I do want to thank you. It's been great to have a session where we had an engaged and informed audience attending. Then 2 other things. One thing is that obviously it's an important and interesting subject, and your views will have been either challenged or confirmed during the course of this session. I know mine have. And it would be very interesting to hear what you think about this and what the impact of this debate has been on your thinking of this question. So we'll be in touch with you over the email, and you have to reply telling us how your views have changed. The second thing is that I was delighted to see that we finally did reach some points of disagreement between people in this room, and in the effort to find some more, I'd like to invite all of you of all different religions and of none to come and have some refreshments with us just around the corner there. So thanks very much.